It's working this time. Great. Well, we've had a very long break from looking at Westminster Confession of Faith, so let me tell you what we're going to do. Well, so far, we thought about how do we know anything about God at all? And the answer is God reveals himself to us, and in particularly, we thought about the Bible, and so how God has made himself known through the Bible. And we thought over quite a few weeks about who God is and what he is like. And to give you a one-word summary, big. Really big in terms of his power and his character and so on. Obviously, we dug a lot more into that. And we thought a little bit towards the end about what we are like. So we thought about the fact we are made in God's image, so we have dignity and responsibility, but also we're fallen. And that's where we left it. And so now we're thinking about how we relate to God. And people often say, Christians especially, like to distance themselves from religion, in the worst sense of that word, and they say, well, I don't have a religion, I have a relationship. And in a sense, that's right to focus on the relationship with God, but what do we mean? As we have loads of relationships, what do we mean by a relationship with God? And the answer is, and we touched on this on Sunday, I think, the answer is covenant. We have a covenant relationship with God. And that's a word perhaps we don't use very often. That's used sometimes in property. But the equivalent things we have is marriage is a covenant. And we have things a bit like covenants, like contracts and international treaties and things like that. But also covenant in the Bible is kind of like there's a few ideas that keep running through the Bible. One of them is covenant. And arguably, and Presbyterians are going to say this anyway, arguably the Bible shaped around covenant and the sort of changing pace of the covenant. So what I'm going to say tonight is actually quite simple, but the Confession of Faith is a bit long here. But what I'm going to do is just read it to you, and you might think, if you read it by yourself in your own pace, you probably go, this is quite straightforward. If you're just listening to it, it probably seems a bit stodgy. But and then I'm just going to comment on a few bits and a couple of times pause to either chuck a question out to you or for you to come back to me. But I'll just read it and then comment on it. So this is chapter 7 of the Confession of Faith, called Of God's Covenant with Man. The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience to him as their creator, they could never have any enjoyment of him as their blessedness and reward, but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he has pleased to express by the way of covenant. The first covenant made with man was a covenant of works, wherein life was promised to Adam and in him to his posterity, upon condition of perfect and personal obedience. Man, by his fall, having made himself incapable of life by that covenant, the Lord was pleased to make a second, commonly called the covenant of grace, wherein he freely offers unto sinners life and salvation by Jesus Christ, requiring of them faith in him, that they may be saved, and promising to give unto all those who are ordained unto life his Holy Spirit, to make them willing and able to believe. This covenant of grace is frequently set forth in Scripture by the name of a testament, in reference to the death of Jesus Christ as testator and to everlasting inheritance, with all things belonging to it, therein bequeathed. This covenant was differently administered in the time of the law and in the time of the gospel. Under the law, it was administered by promises, prophecies, sacrifices, circumcision, and the Passover lamb, and other types and ordinances delivered to the people of the Jews, all foreshadowing Christ to come, which were for that time sufficient and efficacious through the operation of the Spirit to instruct and to build up the elect in faith in the promised Messiah, by whom they had full remission of sins and eternal salvation, and is called the Old Testament. Under the gospel, when Christ the substance was exhibited, the ordinances which this covenant is dispensed are the preaching of the word and the administration of the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, which though fewer in number and administered with more simplicity and less outward glory, yet in them it is held forth in more fullness, evidence and spiritual efficacy to all nations, both Jews and Gentiles. It is called the New Testament. There are not therefore two covenants of grace, differing in substance, but one and the same under various administrations. So that's it in a nutshell. It's actually not that complicated if you sort of read it slowly. But I'm just going to make a few comments about it. And actually, we've done some of this before. I did a series on Sunday evenings on the covenant. We did a Bible overview, and we sort of saw how there's these turning points in God's covenant with us. So in the first couple of sections, the problem that's been set up in the Bible, when you start the Bible, God makes everything and humanity falls pretty quickly. And we have something like this in the Confession of Faith as well. So the problem is, how can a holy, powerful God meet with sinful but accountable people like us? How can we meet and relate with this God and do so safely? And the short answer is God has to come down to us in some way. In some way, the initiative has to be with him. And the word there is condescension or condescend. This doesn't mean he's patronising, but it means he comes down to us in some way. We can't go up to him yet. We can't take the first move and take the initiative to go to him. He has to meet with us and save us for us to do that. So, for example, Isaiah 40:15, surely the nations are like a drop in the bucket. So we're just the speck. How can we work our way to him? He needs to come to us. And we relate to him by covenants. That's how he's chosen to do that. And a covenant is a formal bond or a treaty. So I mentioned marriage. That's a covenant between equals. Two people, a man and a woman, make this formal agreement which bonds them together. And in the sort of times that the Bible was written in, you'd have greater and lesser kings. A sort of an emperor and a sort of smaller regional king would come to a covenant agreement together. And what you would have is you'd have conditions. You have these in the wedding as well, but it's between equals. You have conditions that are put on them, that there's a boundary around what this covenant is and isn't. There are blessings and there are curses, and it's sealed or signalled in some way. There's something that marks a covenant has started. This is some new special relationship. And when we looked at covenant before, we went into a bit of detail about some of those signs and seals. And so there are conditions on both sides. The great king has conditions, and the lesser king has conditions. Husband and wife have conditions. They're pretty much the same conditions, but you get the point. And so God has bound himself to us. Tim Keller talked about covenant being like a promise with teeth. So how do you know God's going to keep his promise to you? Well, I think probably his promise is enough. I mean, it's God. He's got a good track record. But actually, he has bound himself. He's kind of legally bound himself to you. So the second bit of that is about the first covenant, which we might easily overlook. The first covenant is with the first two people, particularly with Adam, and it's called here the covenant of works. There's other names people call it. For example, the covenant of Adam, the first covenant, confusingly perhaps the covenant of death or the covenant of life. It's called the covenant of life because it gives life, but it's called the covenant of death because when it's broken, it brings death. And the Bible doesn't give it a name, so we should chill out about that, but I often call it works. And so in Genesis 2:17, there's a condition. It says, do not eat of this fruit. So it has one condition. It's a very simple covenant. It's often referred to covenant, or a few times it's referred to in other bits of the Bible back to it as being a covenant. So Adam has been given, and Eve have been given one tree of no in a forest of yes, and you know how the story ends. So the promises to Adam has no condition. So these promises to Adam: if you obey, you will live. If you eat, you will die. Now, can you see two problems? I'll tell you what they are, unless anyone wants to butt in. I know you're all too shy when you know I'm videoing, that's not live. The two problems are, one, there's no provision for forgiveness. It says, do this and live, don't do this, you die. And the second one is the promises to all of Adam's offspring. So that means all of humanity is now in problems. I'm going to pause for a second. going to carry on. So the next bit says, and this is kind of the heart of it really, man, by his fall, having made himself incapable of life by that covenant, the Lord was pleased to make a second, commonly called the covenant of grace, wherein he freely offers unto sinners life and salvation by Jesus Christ, requiring of them faith in him that they may be saved, and promising to give unto all those who are obtained unto life his Holy Spirit, to make them willing and able to believe. So what he's saying is that first covenant we've all broken. You might think, well, I didn't, because God didn't speak to me, but in Adam you broke that covenant, and there's nothing we can do about that. But God made a second covenant, a covenant of grace, and it's grace because it's a gift. He wasn't obliged to do this. So I sometimes say when I'm preaching to look for the surprises. First surprise in the Bible is Genesis 4 verse 1, and the surprise is that it's there. Because under the covenant conditions, God could just say, that ends history. But he doesn't. He carries on, and he's gracious. And so God makes this second covenant, the covenant of grace. And the covenant of grace is a free offer of salvation in Jesus Christ by Spirit-enabled faith. So the Spirit enables us to have faith, to put our trust in Jesus Christ, and we'll be saved. Now on our website, if you go to our church website, there's a link. So we did a couple of things for anyone who's maybe not a Christian. So there's a couple of links, one to 2 Ways to Live, and one to a thing called 321 by Glenn Scrivener. And it basically, this is what Glenn Scrivener has really simplified the Westminster Confession of Faith 7.3, and he's done it in 321. So it is that there is one God in three persons, which means there are two heads of humanity, Adam and Christ. Be one with Christ. That's the Bible. So 321, the one God in three persons, two leaders of humanity. Which one are you under? Be one with Christ. So what he's explaining there is that Jesus kept the covenant that we broke. Adam broke it, we've broken the covenant. Jesus kept the covenant, but we're now credited with keeping it. And Jesus took the covenant curse that we deserved. So what should have fallen on us, what should have fallen on Adam, fell on Jesus. Now you might be thinking at this point, well, that was a jump. What about the whole Old Testament? You've just gone from Genesis 3 to Matthew 1. We'll come to that. The fourth bit of the confession talks about the testament. So in the Greek Old Testament, the word covenant, they translate testament. And it means the same thing. But in some later language, like English, covenant and testament mean slightly different things. But the idea, there's I'll come to it in a second, but the idea is of the last will and testament, and the idea that we have an eternal inheritance. Now, the context of the Westminster Confession is that there were lots of arguments about, is it a covenant or a testament? And what they do here is, which is interesting because we often think of these kind of people as pedants and really picky, but what they do is they call it a covenant, and they explain it as a covenant, but say, but you can call it a testament if you want, because it does that as well, doesn't it? And I think that's right, that it is a covenant relationship, but it functions as a testament. So you find both ideas in the Bible. I think covenant is stronger. So we have this covenant bond with God, and we know he's committed himself to us, but we also have this will and testament and inheritance. So I didn't want to say any more about that. But now comes the bit, why did he jump past the Old Testament? He now talks about the Old Testament. And this is section 5. So this covenant, it says, this covenant was differently administered in the time of the law and in the time of the gospel. So it's the same covenant. It's not the same one with Adam, but the covenant of grace that comes after. It's the same relationship, the same covenant, but administered differently. Now, when we looked at covenant before, I said it's a bit like the way the Old Testament works is in these phases is a bit like Windows upgrades. So every now and then my computer tells me I need to have all my software upgraded, and it's meant to make it better. And sometimes it does. Sometimes it dies for a bit. And so that's how the Bible, in a much better way, works, is that the covenant upgrades. It's one covenant idea, but it sort of expands and improves and upgrades as we go through. So under the Old Covenant administration, we have the law, we have promises, we have prophecies, we have ceremonies like sacrifices, and when we looked at Leviticus, there's all these different kinds of sacrifices. There's circumcision, there's the Passover, and there are things like kings, prophets and priests. And all of those people and activities and things all point us to Jesus Christ. And they all show us different aspects of who he is and what he did. They are shadows. So it's interesting, you look at the Bible and you've got a lot of Old Testament and not very much New Testament, and of the New Testament, not that much of it is the Gospels, which is the heart of it. You think, size-wise, shouldn't it be the other way? All this stuff is explaining who Jesus is and what he does. So we understand when he comes, and even though you can just read a Gospel and become a Christian, as you go back to the Old Testament, it sort of puts colour on it. So it's saying the covenant is the same, but they're administered differently. So they are, so they are shadows. They're not the substance. They point to the substance, but the covenant is the same. They are, however, effective. They said in the Spirit by faith. So when a faithful Jew did one of their sacrifices or circumcised their son, they were putting their faith in Christ. They might not have used those words, but I think if you could take them in a time machine to one of our services, they may be surprised, but they would sort of know what we're talking about. Even if they might not use those words, they were putting their trust in Jesus as they were doing these things. People often say, well, before Jesus, how did people go to heaven? They were putting their trust in Jesus through these shadows. So, 7.3 comes before 7.5. It may not make any sense, but that's why. How are you saved? By Jesus Christ. How was Abraham saved? Through Jesus Christ. How was anyone going to be saved? Through Jesus Christ. So Old Testament believers are saved the same way that we are, through the same Christ, through the same sacrifice and resurrection of Christ. But it was administered them differently because they come before him in the timeline. Now, I put down all the cross-references. All the cross-references sort of show how in the New Testament we're continuing the old covenant. We're continuing the one covenant, but it's going to look different because now Christ has come. So in Hebrews 11:13, which I think is all of Hebrews 11 is great for this, but particularly verse 13, these all died. This all the people of the old covenant, Abraham and so on. They all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. And so they did their sacrifices. They journeyed through the wilderness to the promised land and all sorts of things, knowing that that wasn't the final destination. But by going there, they were showing faith in where those things were pointing. So before we do the last bit and before I close, a question for you is, why would it be bad, so thinking about the book of Hebrews and what we've just thought about, why would it be bad to return to Old Covenant rituals? And then let's see if you've got any other questions. Last bit, in section 6, I suppose you could say is how does the covenant work in practice? And that's what the rest of the Confession of Faith is like in some ways. But what it talks about here is Christ being the substance of the covenant. Christ is what it's all about. How do we receive him? Well, through the preaching of the word and the administration of the sacraments. And they're very simple. But the point of that they're making here is that preaching and baptism and the Lord's Supper are not spectacular. So it talks about fewer in number, less in outward glory, which is great as well. They were very good in their grammar, weren't they? They didn't say less twice. Fewer in number, less in outward glory. So they had all these sacrifices. They had Passover, they had circumcision, they had certain things to do with the priests, they had prophets, kings, so on. We just have these two signs, and we have the preaching of the word, and that's it. So our worship is going to be much more straightforward. So worship is not as bling, shall we say. So Hebrews talks about, and things like this happen today, where people want glory in their worship. And so they desire to go back to a sort of old covenant look, where there's lots of gold and dressing up and trumpets and ritual and so on. But because Christ is the substance, all the glory is in him, and all that has been done. But what they are saying here, and we'll come to this in a few weeks in 2 Corinthians, is actually the new covenant is more glorious. So it's interesting, isn't it? When we do the Lord's Supper, we just have a few cups and a bit of bread, and we say some words and pray and distribute them. It's really simple compared to an old covenant sacrifice. And yet it's more glorious because Christ has already died, and that he is, by his Spirit, feeding us as we take. Same with baptism, you just splash the water on somebody, and yet that's more glorious than these sort of rituals that they had in the Old Testament, and preaching that Paul talks about looks so foolish, and sometimes I can confirm as a preacher I often feel foolish, but it's greater than the old covenant. So it's simpler, there's fewer, but it's no less glory than before. But it's something I suppose we take more by faith than by sight. We're meant to have God's people matured into that, and it is effective. We'll do something about why it's effective later on in the confession. So he then goes on to say there's one covenant, not two. It also means there's one people of God, not two. That's been expanded. So it's not there's a Jewish church and then there's a Gentile church. There's the God's people that was largely ethnically defined, and then, but not entirely, and it's broadened out to include people like us. So one covenant, not two. So that's key idea. And I suppose some of the things we look at in future weeks is more about how we relate to God through this covenant. And so what we need now for a covenant to work is you need a covenant mediator, a covenant go-between. And that's what we'll think about next time. So just as we close, I'm going to ask you if there's any things that you think are particularly encouraging about that. I find the idea of covenant really helpful in day-to-day Christian living and as a minister for a number of reasons. And I just wonder if you did. And then we'll just wrap up with any questions, and then we'll pray.